Marsh Court, a name that once evoked images of peaceful living. It was a place where children's laughter echoed in the courtyard. Neighbors exchanged friendly greetings, a sense of community thrived. The flats, though modest, held the promise of a comfortable life. Among the residents were Martin and Peter. Their lives were ordinary, their days filled with the routines of work and leisure. Martin, a man of keen observation, possessed an innate understanding of human behavior. Peter, pragmatic and skeptical, questioned everything. They were an unlikely pair, yet their friendship added a comforting rhythm to their lives. Years passed, seasons changed, and Marsh Court remained a haven. But beneath the surface of normalcy, a subtle shift was taking place, an unsettling transformation that would soon shatter the tranquility. The once familiar faces of their neighbors seemed different, haunted even. Whispers of strange occurrences began to circulate. Insomnia plagued the residents. Anxiety cast a pall over their interactions. The very essence of their community seemed to be unraveling. Then came the incidents. Two neighbors, their minds seemingly unhinged, were taken away in ambulances. The sirens seemed to scream a warning. What was happening within the walls of Marsh Court? The question lingered, unanswered. Martin, his concern growing, found himself drawn to the windows. He observed the comings and goings of his neighbors, searching for clues. Something was amiss, he was sure of it. The harmony of their community had been disrupted by an unknown force.
At first, I dismissed Martin's concerns. I mean, it all seemed a bit far-fetched, right? But as the evidence mounted, even I couldn't ignore the unsettling truth. Marsh Court was no longer a haven. It had become a prison of fear and paranoia.
The once comforting silence of Marsh Court was now filled with unsettling noises. Through the thin walls, Martin could hear the murmur of voices, agitated and laced with fear. Sleep, once a refuge, became a battleground against the phantom sounds of distress. He often found himself wide awake in the dead of night, listening to the creaking pipes and the muffled sobs that seemed to seep from the very walls.
One evening, as Martin returned home from work, he encountered Mrs. Henderson, an elderly resident known for her cheerful disposition, in the dimly lit hallway. Her eyes, usually bright and welcoming, were clouded with a deep-seated fear. She clutched her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "They're watching us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're always watching."
Martin, unsure of how to respond, offered her a comforting pat on the arm. He wanted to dismiss her words as the ramblings of an aging mind, but deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. The incident with Mrs. Henderson was not an isolated one. More and more residents reported feeling like they were being watched, their every move scrutinized by unseen eyes. The usually vibrant community meetings, once filled with laughter and shared stories, were now tense and filled with suspicion. Neighbors who were once close now eyed each other warily, their conversations strained. The invisible bonds that had once held the community together were slowly unraveling, replaced by an atmosphere of fear and mistrust. Peter, ever the skeptic, remained unconvinced about the idea of being watched. He reasoned that the residents' anxieties stemmed from the recent unsettling events, their minds playing tricks on them. However, as the reports of unusual occurrences continued to mount, even Peter had to admit that something was amiss.
One afternoon, while fixing a leaky faucet in my bathroom, I noticed something peculiar. A tiny blinking light, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, was emanating from the smoke detector. Curiosity piqued, I carefully removed the device from the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. To my astonishment, I discovered a miniature camera lens cleverly concealed within the smoke detector's casing. A cold shiver ran down my spine as the realization hit me. Marsh Court was riddled with hidden cameras, their every move recorded and analyzed.
The landlord, once perceived as a harmless, albeit slightly eccentric figure, now took on a more sinister persona in Peter's mind. The extent of the surveillance became horrifyingly clear when Peter noticed similar cameras disguised as buttons on the fire alarm panel in the hallway. He realized that the landlord had access to a live feed of their lives, watching their every move, listening to their every word. Privacy, once taken for granted, had become a luxury they could no longer afford. The question that now haunted Peter was not whether they were being watched, but why. What sinister purpose did this constant surveillance serve? And who was behind it all? The answers, he feared, were far more disturbing than he could have ever imagined. The once peaceful courtyard of Marsh Court, once alive with the laughter of children, now stood eerily deserted. The swings hung motionless, a testament to the fear that had gripped the community. Parents kept their children indoors, their playful shouts replaced by an unsettling silence. Tensions reached a breaking point when Mr. Jones, a quiet and reserved man who lived on the second floor, suffered a complete mental breakdown.
Residents watched in horror as he ran through the hallway, shouting incoherently, his eyes wild with fear and paranoia.
The arrival of the paramedics, their sirens shattering the tense silence, did little to ease the growing sense of panic. That night, a sense of unease hung heavy in the air, as tangible as the summer humidity that clung to their skin. Martin and Peter, their faces etched with concern, met in the dimly lit stairwell, their usual meeting place now transformed into a clandestine gathering spot.
"This is getting out of hand," Martin whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the faulty fluorescent light overhead. "We need to do something, Peter. We can't just sit here and watch as our neighbors lose their minds."
Peter, his face pale in the flickering light, nodded in agreement.
"I agree, Martin, but what can we do? We're up against something bigger than ourselves."
Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps echoing from the floor above. They froze, their hearts pounding in their chests, as the footsteps drew closer, stopping right outside their door. A cold dread washed over them as they realized they were no longer safe, even within the confines of their own homes. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down on Martin and Peter. Their once ordinary lives had become a stage, their every move observed and analysed. The landlord, Mr. Davies, a man they once considered merely reclusive, now loomed over them like a spectre, his motives shrouded in mystery. Mr. Davies had always maintained a strange distance from the tenants. His interactions were brief, his words carefully measured. His office, located on the ground floor, was a fortress of privacy, its windows permanently blacked out. Rumours circulated about his past, whispers of a life shrouded in secrecy. One afternoon, as Martin passed by Mr. Davies's office, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. A flicker of movement inside caught his eye. Curiosity overwhelming his better judgment, he cautiously approached the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Through the narrow gap, he saw Mr. Davies, hunched over a bank of monitors, his face illuminated by the flickering screens. The images on the monitors sent a chill down Martin's spine. There, displayed in grainy detail, were scenes from the lives of the Marsh Court residents. The courtyard, the hallways, even the interior of some of the flats, all were under constant surveillance. Mr. Davies, his face a mask of cold detachment, watched the residents' every move, his eyes betraying a disturbing intensity. Peter, his mind racing with questions, decided to investigate further. He spent hours poring over the building's blueprints, searching for clues about the extent of the surveillance. His efforts led him to the basement, a labyrinth of dusty pipes and cobwebs. There, hidden behind a false wall, he discovered the nerve center of Mr. Davies's operation. The room was filled with electronic equipment, servers, monitors, and a bewildering array of wires and cables. The air hummed with the sound of cooling fans, the only indication of the vast amount of data being processed within those walls. Peter felt a sense of dread wash over him as he realized the true extent of Mr. Davies's surveillance. It was far more sophisticated than he could have ever imagined. As Peter examined the equipment, he noticed something even more disturbing. The surveillance system was not limited to cameras and microphones. Sensors were strategically placed throughout the building, monitoring everything from temperature fluctuations to water usage patterns. It was as if Mr. Davies was conducting a bizarre experiment, his tenants unwitting subjects in his twisted game. The question that gnawed at Peter's mind was why? What possible motive could Mr. Davies have for subjecting his tenants to such invasive surveillance? Was he simply a control freak, obsessed with monitoring every aspect of their lives, or was something more sinister at play? The residents of Marsh Court, unaware of the watchful eyes upon them, continued with their lives. But the atmosphere of unease persisted, a constant reminder that something was amiss. Paranoia festered in the shadows, poisoning their once harmonious community. Mrs. Peterson, a kind-hearted woman who always had a smile for her neighbors, now scurried through the hallways, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher who enjoyed tending to his rooftop garden, now kept his curtains drawn, afraid to venture outside his flat. The once vibrant community meetings, once a forum for shared stories and laughter, were now tense and subdued. Conversations were guarded, smiles strained. Trust, once the bedrock of their community, had eroded, replaced by suspicion and fear. The price of privacy, it seemed, was far greater than any of them could have imagined. It was a price paid in fear, in isolation, and in the gradual erosion of the bonds that held them together. And as the walls of Marsh Court closed in around them, the residents found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Martin, a voracious reader with a penchant for history and politics, found himself drawn to online forums discussing government overreach and social engineering. Theories that once seemed like the stuff of science fiction now held a chilling resonance with the events unfolding at Marsh Court. Could their landlord's intrusive surveillance be part of a larger, more sinister agenda orchestrated by powerful forces within the government? He delved deeper into the shadowy world of conspiracy theories, encountering tales of mind control experiments, covert surveillance programs, and the manipulation of entire populations. While he had always maintained a healthy skepticism, these accounts, often dismissed as the ramblings of the paranoid, now seemed eerily familiar. One particular theory sent a shiver down Martin's spine: the concept of the deep state. This clandestine network, operating beyond the reach of public scrutiny, was said to wield immense power, manipulating governments and shaping global events from the shadows. Could the deep state be behind the strange occurrences at Marsh Court, using the residents as unwitting subjects in a twisted social experiment? As Martin connected the dots between the theories he read online and the unsettling reality of their situation, he felt a growing sense of unease. The lines between conspiracy and reality blurred, leaving him to grapple with the terrifying possibility that the government, the very entity entrusted with their safety and well-being, might be their unseen tormentor.
Meanwhile, my pragmatic mind searching for tangible evidence, I recalled the bi-weekly water tests conducted in our building. Every other Tuesday, men in unmarked overalls would arrive, their faces obscured by caps pulled low, and collect water samples from each flat. No explanation was ever given, no results ever shared. At first, I had dismissed it as routine maintenance, a necessary inconvenience of apartment living, but now the memory sparked a chilling thought. Could the water be the source of the residents' increasingly erratic behavior? Could some unknown substance, a mind-altering drug or a subtle neurotoxin, be leaching into our water supply, slowly poisoning our minds and bodies? I remembered reading about government experiments involving the mass medication of unsuspecting populations, their food or water supply tainted with experimental drugs. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Could we be victims of a similar program, our minds and bodies manipulated without our knowledge or consent? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became. The timing coincided perfectly. The unsettling changes in the residents' behavior began shortly after the water tests became a regular occurrence. I had to find proof to expose the truth before it was too late. but where could I even begin?
Section 3. The Deep State's Shadow. Martin, his mind abuzz with conspiracy theories, decided to investigate the Deep State further. He sought out local activists, journalists, and anyone who might have information about government overreach and covert operations. His search led him to a dimly lit pub in a rundown part of town, a known hangout for those who questioned the official narrative. There, amidst the haze of cigarette smoke and the murmur of hushed conversations, Martin met a grizzled old reporter, a man who had spent his career exposing corruption and abuse of power. The reporter listened intently as Martin recounted the strange events at Marsh Court, his eyes narrowing as he spoke of the landlord's surveillance and the residents' deteriorating mental state. "You've stumbled onto something big, son," the reporter rasped, his voice gravelly from years of chain smoking. "The Deep State doesn't like to be exposed. They'll do anything to protect their secrets." The reporter's words confirmed Martin's worst fears. They were up against a powerful and ruthless enemy, one that operated in the shadows and had no qualms about silencing those who dared to question their authority. But fear was a luxury they could no longer afford. The truth had to be exposed, no matter the cost. Section 4. The Unmarked Vans. Peter, driven by his suspicions about the water, decided to take a closer look at the men who conducted the bi-weekly tests. He waited patiently in his flat, peering through a crack in the blinds as they made their rounds. The men arrived as usual, their faces hidden, their movements swift and practiced. As they approached his neighbor's door, Peter slipped out of his flat and followed them, keeping a safe distance. He watched as they collected the water sample, their movements mechanical, their faces betraying no emotion. Then, as they turned to leave, Peter noticed something peculiar. An unmarked van parked at the end of the street, its engine idling. The men quickly loaded their equipment into the van and sped off, disappearing into the city's labyrinthine streets. Peter, his heart pounding in his chest, memorized the van's license plate number.
I knew I had to find out who those men were and what they were doing with our water.
Driven by a mixture of fear and determination, Peter returned to his flat and immediately began researching the license plate number online. His search led him to a dead end, a shell corporation registered to a post office box in another state. It was clear that someone was going to great lengths to conceal their identity and their activities, but who and why? Section 1. A Tapestry of Fear. Martin, driven by a need for answers, decided to confide in his neighbors to gauge their experiences. He started with Mrs. Garcia, a kindly old woman who always had a plate of cookies to share. Her usually bright eyes were clouded with anxiety as she spoke of sleepless nights, plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and unseen observers.
"I can't sleep, Martin. Every night it's the same. Those shadowy figures, watching."
He then approached Mr. Singh, a stoic man who kept to himself. To Martin's surprise, Mr. Singh readily shared his own unsettling experiences. He spoke of sudden bouts of dizziness, heart palpitations, and an overwhelming sense of dread that permeated his days.
"It's like a constant weight on my chest. I can't shake this feeling of dread."
As Martin continued his informal survey, a disturbing pattern emerged. Nearly every resident he spoke to reported similar experiences: insomnia, anxiety, paranoia, and a pervasive feeling of being watched. Their stories, though varied in detail, were woven together by a common thread of fear and uncertainty. It was as if an invisible hand had descended upon Marsh Court, slowly poisoning their minds and bodies. The once vibrant tapestry of their community, woven with threads of trust, camaraderie, and shared experiences, was unraveling before his very eyes, replaced by a patchwork of fear, suspicion, and isolation. Martin knew he had to act fast before the fabric of their community was torn apart completely. Peter, armed with the van's license plate number, decided to pay a visit to a friend, a retired police officer with a nose for digging up information. His friend, initially skeptical of Peter's claims, agreed to run the plate through his old contacts. The results were unsettling. The van was registered to a private security firm with ties to government contracts. The firm's reputation was shrouded in secrecy, its activities whispered about in hushed tones. They were known for their ruthlessness, their methods often bordering on illegal.
These people don't play by the rules, Peter. If you're getting too close to something you shouldn't, they won't hesitate to silence you.
Peter, though shaken by his friend's warning, refused to be deterred. He had stumbled upon a conspiracy that reached far beyond the walls of Marsh Court. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. Lives were at risk, their very freedom hanging in the balance. The long arm of the law, it seemed, was not a source of protection, but a tool of oppression, wielded by unseen forces to maintain their grip on power. Peter knew he had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Martin and Peter, their paths converging, decided to combine their findings. They met in a secluded corner of a local park, the rustling leaves and chirping birds a stark contrast to the turmoil that churned within them. They shared their discoveries, their voices hushed, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, forming a disturbing picture of government overreach and social manipulation.
The landlord's intrusive surveillance, the water tests, the unmarked vans, the residents' deteriorating mental state. It's all interconnected, part of a larger, more sinister agenda.
As they spoke, a police car cruised slowly past. Its windows tinted its presence, a silent reminder that they were being watched. Fear gnawed at their resolve, but they refused to be silenced. They had stumbled upon a truth that demanded to be exposed, a truth that could shatter the illusion of freedom and security that their government so carefully constructed. The echoes of truth reverberated through their conversation, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. They knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but they were committed to seeing their mission through. The fate of Marsh Court, and perhaps the very soul of their nation, rested on their shoulders. The weight of their discovery pressed down on Martin and Peter. They were trapped in a web of their own making, their lives entangled with a conspiracy that ran deeper than they could have ever imagined. They knew they had to act fast, but what could they do? They needed a plan, a way to expose the truth without becoming casualties themselves. The residents of Marsh Court, their minds clouded by fear and paranoia, were in no state to help. They were on their own, facing an enemy that operated in the shadows, an enemy with unlimited resources and a ruthless disregard for human life.
We need to get the word out. We need to tell the world what's happening here. They'll never believe us, Martin. We have no proof, no evidence. They'll just dismiss us as paranoid conspiracy theorists. Then we'll give them proof. We'll expose them for what they are.
Martin and Peter huddled over a table, their faces illuminated by a single lamp, a map of Marsh Court spread out before them. Martin and Peter, fueled by a mix of fear and adrenaline, decided to organize a secret meeting with their fellow residents. They knew it was a risky move, but they had to try. They had to break through the wall of fear and paranoia that had divided their community.
They discreetly slipped handwritten notes under doors, their hearts pounding with each delivery.
The notes were brief, urging their neighbors to meet in the building's neglected laundry room at the stroke of midnight. A time and place where they hoped to evade the watchful eyes of their landlord and his unseen collaborators.
As midnight approached, Martin and Peter anxiously awaited the arrival of their neighbors. The laundry room, usually filled with the hum of washing machines, was eerily silent. The air hung heavy with anticipation and a palpable sense of dread.
One by one, their neighbors arrived, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Mrs. Garcia, clutching her rosary beads, her eyes filled with a quiet desperation. Mr. Singh, his face stoic, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Even Mr. Davies, the reclusive landlord, made a surprise appearance, his eyes narrowed, his lips pursed in a thin line.
Martin, his heart pounding in his chest, addressed the gathering. He spoke of the surveillance, the water tests, the unsettling changes in their behavior. He painted a picture of a community under siege, their lives manipulated by unseen forces. As he spoke, he noticed a shift in the room. The initial skepticism gave way to a grudging acknowledgement. His words resonated with their own experiences, confirming their worst fears. They were not alone in their suspicions, their anxieties. They were victims, pawns in a twisted game orchestrated by forces beyond their control.
Suddenly, a loud crash from the hallway shattered the tense silence. Heavy footsteps approached the laundry room door, the sound of keys rattling in the lock, sending a chill down their spines.
Fear gripped their hearts, their newfound unity threatening to crumble in the face of this unexpected intrusion.
"They know we're here," Peter whispered urgently, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. "We need to leave. Now."
They had a choice to make, fight or flight. Do they stand their ground, risking their freedom, perhaps even their lives, to expose the truth? Or do they scatter, disappearing into the shadows, hoping to evade the long reach of their pursuers? The decision, they knew, would have far-reaching consequences, not just for themselves, but for the future of Marsh Court, and perhaps even beyond. Panic seized the room. Martin and Peter exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they were in. They urged their neighbors to flee, to disappear into the labyrinthine corridors of Marsh Court. Chaos erupted as the residents, their faces pale with terror, scrambled for the exit, their newfound unity dissolving in the face of imminent danger.
The heavy door swung open, revealing two figures in dark suits, their faces obscured by the shadows. They were tall and imposing, their movements swift and practiced, their very presence radiating an air of menace. They had come for them, their arrival a chilling confirmation that the walls of Marsh Court were indeed closing in.
Martin and Peter, their escape route cut off, found themselves face to face with their pursuers. Their hearts pounded in their chests, their minds racing, desperately searching for a way out of this impossible situation. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outgunned.
"We know who you are," one of the figures growled, his voice a menacing whisper. "And we know what you've been up to." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. The message was clear. Their investigation had gone too far. Their meddling had attracted the wrong kind of attention.
The weight of their situation pressed down on Martin and Peter. They had stumbled upon a truth too terrible to ignore, a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. But in their pursuit of justice, they had unwittingly become targets, their lives now hanging precariously in the balance.
As the men in suits advanced, their faces grim, their intentions unclear, a glimmer of defiance sparked in Martin's eyes. He had come too far, uncovered too much to be silenced now. He glanced at Peter, a silent question passing between them.
Peter, his face pale but resolute, returned his gaze, a shared determination hardening their resolve. The fate of Marsh Court, a microcosm of society grappling with unseen forces of control, remained uncertain. Would its residents succumb to the suffocating grip of fear and paranoia, their lives forever altered by the events that transpired within those walls? Or would they find a way to fight back, to reclaim their freedom, to expose the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of secrecy and deceit?
In the heart of this urban labyrinth, a battle was being waged, a battle for truth, for justice, for the very soul of a community teetering on the brink of collapse. The outcome, uncertain as it seemed, would have far-reaching consequences, serving as a stark reminder that even in the darkest of times, a glimmer of hope can ignite a fire that burns bright enough to illuminate the path towards a brighter future.